Our title this morning is Living to God's Will. And Peter is bringing us to a contrast. He's going to remind us one more time that Christ died for us. So what are we supposed to do? Since Christ died, his request then becomes that we should live. Not that we should just live, but that we should live for him. He died for you, so now you live for him. And that's what Peter is going to drive home to you and me today. So let us take a look at Peter's words then, 1 Peter chapter 4, the first 6 verses. Therefore, Christ, having suffered for us in the flesh. Now, they make sure to make note of this word in the flesh, because the Greek mind wouldn't allow a perfect person to become sin. So in the Greek mind then, if Christ became sin for us, he must have done it spiritually. And Peter says, no, he did it in the flesh. See, without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sin. So for that purpose, we read in Hebrews, a body thou hast prepared me, Father. Christ in heaven, in the eternities, had no blood. So how could he then shed or die on the cross for us as a spirit? Since the law required a blood sacrifice, Christ in the spirit had no blood. And so Peter wants us to make sure that we understand completely and fully that this was not just some imagination or some apparition. This was a bodily person. This was somebody that we could feel and touch. The apostles would later say, of whom we have felt, of whom we have touched. So they want to make sure, and we need to make sure that we understand this is a physical person, Jesus Christ. This is a real person. This was not an imaginary person who died for some imaginary sins. But this was God in the flesh. Therefore, Christ, having suffered for us in the flesh, also now he says you need to arm yourself with this same thought that he had. That he, suffering in the flesh, has been made a rest from sin. Christ died for us so that we would be freed from the penalty and the weight of sin. That's what Christ was thinking. I'm going to die to save you from sin. So Peter says to us, why don't we think that same thought? Christ died to save me from sin. So maybe I should stay away from it. That's kind of what he's getting at here, right? So he's been made a rest in order no longer to live in the lusts of men. Here's where he comes down now. See, we're not supposed to live for us. We're not supposed to live for this body. We're not supposed to live for the joys of this world. We're supposed to be living for God. That's much of what the songs that we were singing this morning reminded us about. So he says, suffering in the flesh, having been made rest, in order no longer to live in the lusts of men, but in the will of God. That's where we're at today, in the will of God. The remaining time, as long as I got in this flesh, whatever time, I got saved young, so since I was a younger man, I've been required to live in this flesh for Jesus Christ. I've done my best at that, not perfectly, but did the best that I could. So, for the time of our flesh is in past is enough for us to have worked out the will of the nations, they're the Gentiles, having gone on in lasciviousness. Listen what he's going to tell us we're really like. Lascivious, lust, excess of wine, parties, carousing, abominable idolatries. In these things, they're surprised that you no longer run with them. How come you ain't a partier? In these things, they are surprised that you are not running with them into the same excess, not blaspheming, but they shall give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. There's the warning. They have to give an account. We have to give an account. Everyone will account for themselves. You and I, though, will have Jesus Christ to stand up for us and say, Father, I died for that one. Father, I died for that one. People who have not received Jesus Christ will stand before the Father someday, and when he looks at them and starts to call on the roll call of sin that they have committed, what can they say? Guilty, 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 guilty. I'd much rather have Jesus as my lawyer and not have to say a word than to go through that litany of sins that I have committed and have God condemn me for them. It's our choice. We make it now. But they give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For to this end the gospel was preached also to the dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. All right, comes down to this. He says to us basically, listen, I want you to purpose patiently to suffer rather than to fail to please God. It's better for you to, remember he's been talking about suffering all last week. Suffer, suffer, suffer. Jesus suffered, we're going to suffer. So here's suffer rather than fail to please God. If I have to please somebody, I got three peoples I could please. I could please the world, I could please myself, or I can please God. And he says, let's default to pleasing God whenever we have the chance. So let's take a look at this first thought. The first three verses give us this thought, that the lessons of man's past life teach us this one thing. Well, actually two things I'm going to give you. One is sadness. When you consider our past life, enough of sin, Peter says to us. Peter knows all about sin. I mean, he was an older fellow by the time Jesus found him. Probably upwards of 30, maybe in his 40s by the time Jesus found him, right? So he had enough of sin. He had enough because it's degradation to self. Sin wears us out. Sin tears us down. You look at those people in the streets that you pass from time to time, these homeless folks. Most of them are homeless not because they lost a job, but they're homeless because they're addicted to drugs or they're addicted to alcohol. And so they have no life whatsoever. Well, once they were young, and once they had a promising future just like all of us do. But they made a choice. They chose to rather to serve sin for a season, and sin took hold of them. I had a professor used to always say, when you're done with sin, sin's not done with you. And wow, what a truth that is. So it may be that you take a drink, and the old saying was that you take a drink, then the drink takes a drink, and then finally the drink takes you. Might be prejudicial on my part, but being Native American, I don't like to drink. I was always afraid that, hey, my father was an alcoholic. And so I was always afraid that if he was, I'm probably no better than my dad. So if I start to drink, even casually, I might end up an alcoholic. So for that reason, I don't need to take the drink. Therefore, the drink won't need to take a drink, and the drink will never take me. See, this is what Peter is saying. See, we live in the same flesh. We have the same weaknesses as everybody else. And to think we're somehow immune to it, that's not a sobering thought, if you would. So, again, enough of sin because of what it does to ourselves, Peter says. But more importantly, look at the injustices we cause others when we are involved in sin. How man has hurt his fellow man. I'll give you World War II as an example. I'll give you the Germans to the Jews as an example. I'll give you the white man to the Indians, if you want another example. I mean, just look at what man does to his fellow creatures. You can go to Chicago any weekend you want and see what men do to their fellow men. You can go downtown LA, see what men do to their fellow men. See, when we look at it, see, sadness is part of sin because what we can do to ourselves, but also what we might do to others. We look at families that are divorced and broken up because of sin. Either she wants it or he wants it, and they don't want the same thing. They each want their own sin. Sin is a very sad thing. And Peter says to us, don't you think you all had enough of that? And then thirdly, sin, not only what it does to us and what we do to each other, but sin is also responsible for our rebellion against God. The whole world is constantly shaking its fist at God like he doesn't matter or he doesn't count. They like to blame God for all the troubles they create. Rebellion against God is a sadness. I think if those homeless peoples out there turned to Jesus Christ instead of to alcohol or drugs or whatever they turn to, if they turned to Jesus Christ, I think they'd find joy and happiness. I think they'd find their way out. I think those men would find their way back to work and able to provide for their own. We used to go down to the Skid Row Mission. I used to preach there every month, or I think one Monday a month. The first Monday of the month, our church would go there and I would preach. And I'd preach to those men because back in those days, I didn't know where my dad was, and as far as I knew, he could be one of those men out there. And so I used to tell them, I feel sorry. I said, I don't have a drug story to tell you. You know, I was never hooked on drugs. I was never hooked on alcohol. So I can't put myself in your shoes. I said, but I'm preaching to my dad, and you might be sitting out there tonight. And I told him how my dad was an alcoholic last time I saw him. And it's possible, I said, of these 800 men sitting out here, maybe one of you is my dad. And so, Dad, this is what I want to say to you. And then I would preach my sermon and give an invitation and watch 30, 40, 50 men come forward at the end. And then sometimes you'd meet them later and it changed their lives. They became different. Why? They stopped fighting God. And that allowed God to be on their side. See, the word peace with God means cessation of against us. It means God's no longer against you, but he's on your side. Like that song we sang. There is a victory. Why? Because Jesus is fighting it. God, his reckless love, pushing everything out of the way to find us. That's how it was with me. God moved mountains to find me, to reveal himself to me. And on that day that he did, I received him as my Savior. And my life's been different ever since. I know the sadness of sin. I come from a broken home. I come from an alcoholic home. I've seen the sadness of sin. I've seen too many aunts and uncles. My grandparents, most of them dead before they left their 50s. I think my oldest living grandparent lived to be 72. Oldest living grandmother was 63. I've seen my fair share of sadnesses. I know what sin can do in this world. But here's the good thing that Peter wants to leave us with in these first 3 verses, and that is hope. See, we have forgiveness to our past. Jesus Christ died for sin. When I received Christ as my Lord and Savior, he forgave all my past sins, but that wasn't sufficient for him. He forgave my present and my future sins all at one time. All my sins he nailed to his cross. So suddenly the things that I had done in the past were all forgiven. That I was at peace with God with the way that I had lived, the way I was living, and the way I would ever live. God and I have been at peace all these years because of what he has done for me. That's the hope that we can offer to people. We can offer them hope to escape the sin that they're in, the sadness that is their life. We can give them Jesus Christ. Forgiveness for times past and deliverance from times past. I've been delivered from the life I once lived. I am a saved man. I'm no longer bound to the sins that I once was bound to. It's no longer all about me. It's all about him. And the great joy that comes for living for Jesus. I've learned not to put myself first, but other people first. Not to make excuses for myself, but make excuses for others. And bring them to Jesus Christ. As I said, purpose patiently to suffer rather than to fail to please God is what Peter was talking to you and me about. He then takes us down to verse 4, and he reminds us this, notwithstanding, and I found this to be true in my life. Bad men wonder at good men's conduct. What Peter said 2,000 years ago, I find very true even today. The thoroughly corrupt man finds it impossible to understand the Christ-like man. They won't understand you. There's three responses that they might take with you. First of all, they think your conduct is strange, and so perhaps they ignore you altogether. I found that I was once quite a popular fellow in school. And when I became a Christian, it's strange how your popularity all of a sudden is gone. When you don't run and do the same things everybody else is doing, nobody wants to run with you. It was easy for people to run to the parties. I mean, if we had a party at our house, it wasn't unusual for over 300 people to show up. The police would come and have to cordon off streets and everything just because we lived in a cul-de-sac for folks to get in and out. There'd be a variety of different gangs out there and members of different motor clubs and stuff. It was always a hectic. You always had the little Argus helicopter, the sheriff's helicopter, circling over the house, and our house was always lighted up. And suddenly but then go ahead and invite those same people to church. You won't get 300. There won't be 300 people knocking your door down to come to a Bible study, I guarantee you. That you'll still find some. If you work hard, you'll still win them. I became known, not for my past life, but I became known as one of those Billy Bible type people. One of them, what we used to call in our day and time, Jesus people. And let me tell you, when I was a Jesus person, I walked alone a lot. When I wasn't a Jesus person, I didn't have to worry about, you couldn't find peace. You couldn't find an alone time. But boy, you come to Jesus, let me tell you, you'll find a lot of alone time, which was great for me because it gave me time alone with Christ, an opportunity to serve Him. So they find it strange, and the first thing they might want to do, and you might discover in your life for serving for Christ, is that people will desert you. It's because they don't understand you. How can anybody be that real with God? Because to them, God is somebody or something they do for an hour on Sunday, not something you do on Monday, not something you do at lunchtime at school, not somebody you walk with on a naval ship, not something that you do when you have shore leave in some strange land. You're supposed to hit the bar if you're a sailor. I didn't. And so it's strange for them. Secondly, though, they might think our conduct strange and become aggravated by it. It's strange, when we would have parties in my house, my mother had no problem. But I brought the Bible in one day. She said, "You won't talk about him in this house." Now later she'd become a Christian and do all the talking herself. But she became aggravated at the fact that I had become a Christian. She was upset that Jesus was real and that I was willing to live for God. She didn't mind the way I was living before. But all of a sudden, living for God, really, that's what you're going to do? You're going to throw your life away living for Jesus? That's exactly what I plan to do. Sometimes folks become aggravated. Now my mom's up in heaven saying, "Shh, don't tell them about that on me." And thirdly, they might think our conduct strange, and this might lead them to inquire. This might lead them to ask. I can't tell you the countless number of people that would walk past me at lunch as I was reading my New Testament and say to me, "What are you doing?" "What is that?" And I'd say, "It's the Bible." "Oh, what does it say?" It says right here, you can go to hell if you don't accept Jesus. And most of the time I'd lead them to Jesus right there over the lunch break. See, they think it's strange. But sometimes they will look at our lives and notice the change. I remember my mother speaking to me on the phone when I was in Pearl Harbor. And she said, back in those days, we used to say it was a long distance call. You don't have those things anymore, but we used to. And I'm chucking those quarters in that machine. And she said to me, "I wish I had what you have." Pivotal point in her life. I wish I had what you have. See, sometimes people will see what we have. They won't like it. They may become aggravated by it. They might ignore us for a time, but there will come a place and a point in their lives where they look at it and say, "I wish I had that." Even at work, where I work at this hospital, many men have walked up to me and have said, I've watched the way you live. Many times men have rededicated. We had several of them sit right here in our own church over the years. When I was a truck driver, my manager came in with me and sat right back there at the back pew. He said, you know what? I was a Christian. I wasn't living for Jesus. When I first walked in there, I had no idea that was a Christian man I was talking to, but my testimony changed his testimony. He left the trucking business because he believed that he was called to preach, and he never did it. He said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back home. I'm going to go to my church. I'm going to apologize to God, and I'm going to become a preacher. We had other men who sat here and rededicated their lives. Lloyd's family who thanked me because they said, you know, we knew our daddy confessed Jesus when he was young, but we were always worried because we never saw it in him. But after he met you, we always saw Jesus in him. And when they did his funeral, they said, we want you to know. We know where our daddy is today. See, sometimes people look at our lives. It might be strange to them, but sometimes they'll inquire about that strangeness in us. And so just keep living, as we sang earlier, living for Jesus. That's what we do. And so let me lead you then to the next thought. Both Christ's judgment and his gospel, and one of our songs was even about this. Both Christ's judgment and his gospel are for all. Either you are going to be warned, everyone will give an answer. Everyone will give an answer. Either you will answer for the sin or for the hope that lies within. Everyone will be called before the judgment seat of God, and either they will have to answer for themselves or Christ will answer for them. But everyone will answer. Fortunately for me, my attorney will stand up, my advocate Jesus Christ, and he'll say, Father, this man has done nothing amiss. And the Father will look at me and say, I find no fault in him. And Jesus will have won another victory. That's what we're talking about when we sing victory in Jesus. That Christ will stand in our place. Just as he took my place on the cross, he will stand in my place before the Father and declare me innocent. And the Father will look at his Son and see him and I as the same thing. Innocent. I have done no sin, the Father will declare. I will be shocked and surprised. But the Father will say to me, what sin are you talking about? All my sins are gone. They're all washed away. That's the promise of Jesus Christ. I will not give an account for my sins to the Father. Jesus Christ will give an account of my righteousness through him to the Father instead. I got to tell you, that's an easy one to go to. It's easy to go to court if you already know you're going to win. Right? It's a little bit scary if you don't know what the judge's going to say to you. But if you could know ahead of schedule that, hey, we got this one, then it's okay. So both the judgment of Christ and the gospel of Christ are for all. You could choose one. You either want the judgment. No, I'd rather have him take my judgment. He already did it. His warning, everyone will give an answer for themselves. All this foolishness you see in the world, at some point in time, this world will stop. And every person, all those who called God foolish, will stand before him. And suddenly they will realize that they were the fool. As they look into God's face, I didn't think you were real. God says, what are you thinking now? Pretty real, aren't I? Yep. And they're going to realize they're in big trouble. Big trouble. Because it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. And oh, if only they had lived for Jesus. The judgment or the gospel? Me, I'm going with the gospel. I like the good news. I like good news much better than judgment. If I could just preach good, happy tidings to people all the time, that'd be wonderful. But sometimes we have to tell them the judgment is coming. We're supposed to preach to the people about sin, righteousness, and judgment to come. Some folks just like to preach happy thoughts. But the Bible says, no, you preach sin. You preach judgment. That's what you're supposed to preach. The sin, judgment. Jesus Christ is coming. And when he comes, he's coming as a judge. So in conclusion, let's consider these thoughts here. Suffering helps us to be like Christ. We don't like it, but it allows us to say, that's what my mother said when she was dying. She said, you know, I never had a chance to win any crowns for Jesus like you did. She said, but maybe my suffering, God's let me win a crown. See, suffering helps us to be like Christ. Yet people do anything they can to avoid. We get a little bit of pain. What's the first thing we do? Oh, where's the ibuprofen? Where's the Tylenol? We don't really like pain, right? I mean, we're not crazy about it. But this is another type. If I'm called to suffer for Jesus Christ, and that's what I do. Followers of Christ, however, should be willing and prepared to do God's will and to suffer if it's necessary. God's not going to have me suffer for no reason, but if there is a reason and a cause for it, He will allow it in my life, and I understand that and know that. There have been many a time when I had to suffer so that people might come to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior. We can overcome sin when we focus on Christ and what He wants us to do. We can become more like Him. That's the victory. Less of me and more of Him. It's like the Baptist said, I must become less important and He must become more important. And that is true in our life. So long as we are the most important person in our lives, and we could tell. And you know what? We can't tell because we can justify how we think about Jesus. Oh, I know I love Jesus. Yeah, but how do you treat others? If I truly love the Lord, you would see a change in the way I treat other people. Because that's really where it's at. By this shall they know you're my disciples. Not that you love me, but that you have love one for another. It's easy to say, oh, how I love Jesus. It's another thing to look at your neighbor and say, boy, I tell you, I love you too. And to be truthful about it. Like we talked about that unfeigned love of the brethren. So we can overcome sin when we focus on Christ and what He wants us to do. We remind ourselves then that pain and danger reveal our true values. If I have to suffer, I don't want it. Well, then you really don't love the Lord. Don't ask me to go without. Don't ask me to do this. Don't ask me to do that. I remember, people used to always say, I'd follow Jesus everywhere so long as He doesn't ask me to be a missionary. I asked Him to let me be a missionary. That was what I wanted. I wanted to be a missionary. I loved it. When I was in the Navy and had an opportunity to travel the world and to bring people to Jesus Christ, that's what I knew I was going to do that for the rest of my life. I was going to be a missionary. God said, nope, you don't get to be a missionary. But everybody else is saying, don't make me a missionary. And I'm down there saying, make me a missionary. And He says, no, I can't. I need you over here. All right. I'll go and let Ella pick on me. But I don't get to be a missionary. Anyone who suffers for doing good and still is faithfully obeying in spite of the suffering has made a clean break from his or her sin. See, if we're willing to suffer and we stay faithful, if we keep obeying God even when it hurts, then we've overcome self. And we have broke the bond of sin. Because sin has no more hold on me. Because I can feel God turning me this way or that way.